I've been having many discussions about the dangers of children being exposed to sex through social media and technology. I also recognize that we can't keep technology and phones away from our kids forever. And so what safety tools can we use to protect our kids? Sean Clifford is the CEO of Canopy, an app that prevents dangerous sexting, pornography, and more. If you're seeking practical advice on tech-safe options, this episode will be helpful. So, Sean, thanks for sitting down with me. I'd love to just hear how you got started in this work that you do.
Of course. First, I have 4 kids. And so as I think about the world that my kids are going to be growing up in and what they're going to be exposed to, I wanted to try and figure out how we could create a way for them to be kids as long as possible and to really push off a lot of the forces that really, with the devices, encroach on them. Ultimately, I want my kids to grow up to be happy, to fall in love, to get married and be happy in that marriage. And all of that is harder if we can't keep some of the toxic content that's out there at bay. Second thing is, I had a very good friend who I sat down with, this was back in 2007, and he asked me what I would do if I made $50 million, never had to work a day again. So I thought, and I gave him my answer. And then I asked him the same question. And he said he would dedicate himself to try to overcome the scourge of pornography. And this was the first time that someone said this was an issue that warranted greater attention. In my mind back then, this was kind of like a back burner thing. It was a nuisance. But ever since then, it's kind of in the back of my mind, I have just seen the suffering that can be caused when people fall down this rabbit hole. And then the third thing is, I think that 2 of the great questions animating our age are, how can we live well with technology, given how prevalent it is today and how early we're adopting it into our lives? And then secondly, how should we think about regulating our appetites as we raise kids in an era in which they have almost immediate access to anything that they can want, to satiate any temptation? What does it look like to actually put guardrails in place? So put those things together and the opportunity to try to actually create a redemptive story for technology, where there was a tool that could actually help us as opposed to simply putting designs upon our time was very enticing.
How did you get access to this world of technology? You came from the policy world or the technology world?
So I'd spent about a decade in Washington, D.C. doing public affairs. A lot of our clients at that time were in the technology space. And so I became very familiar with that arena, how they were thinking about the world, and in particular, how they were thinking about products that were impacting families. So that was kind of the first part. The second is I was also doing a big project in Israel and was introduced to a company that had been developing technology explicitly to try and protect kids online. And so through those 2 worlds, that was where we ultimately were able to kind of bring together the team to try and tackle this problem.
Why was the technology developed in Israel? What did you see there that you decided to bring to the United States?
The team there was very focused on how kids were being impacted by technology in a way that we were not seeing the same attention paid by the big Silicon Valley providers. Now, I think our tech team in Israel is world-class. I think they're inventing things and pioneering advances that can't be replicated elsewhere. So I want to give them a lot of credit. But they're also asking questions that 5 years ago, I did not hear being asked in Silicon Valley. What is the impact of this on kids as they're growing up, when they're exposed to toxic content, when they can find anything and everything at the click of a couple of buttons? And there was a greater attention to that in Israel that I think the big questions that we ask. In the United States, one of the biggest questions is, how are we going to tackle climate change? So a lot of people then start thinking about how they can leverage innovation and policy and whatnot to address that. There's a big emphasis on family in Israel. And so a lot of the energy was going into how can we make sure that families have a fighting chance to navigate this digital world, which is novel. It's completely unlike anything you and I grew up with, and still emerge on the other end healthy, intact, and able to use these tools responsibly.
What have you been seeing in the tech world that is dangerous for kids?
Oh gosh, where to begin? The first thing that I would say is we should note that kids today are struggling. Like the first thing is that we should actually look at the data, and there have been a lot of people that have done this. Perhaps the most notable in the cinema world is The Social Dilemma, which talked about the risks that kids confront. Dr. Jean Twenge wrote a book called iGen, which really documented how the smartphone, which really didn't come about till 2007, so we're still in the early stages of this, has been tied to increased anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, so a whole host of things. But if I were to take a step back and kind of put it in, it's addiction to your device itself, to screen time, to social media, to the validation that that seemingly provides. It is exposure to indecent content, which is what we spend a lot of our time at Canopy trying to address to make sure that kids aren't, through no fault of their own, exposed to a lot of problematic things out there. And then I think the third thing is the anxiety that usually attends social media, where you are very conscious where you stand, where you're left off, where you can be cyberbullied, right? And so it's the addiction piece, it is the indecent content, and then it's the broader anxiety that comes from your entire social life being played out online.
Your specific technology focuses on things like sexting and sextortion. And so what caused you to want to develop that kind of solution for people?
We saw a real gap where a lot of companies had been adopting what we consider to be a blunt instrument, like a mallet approach to the problem. So if you look at the broader category of parental control, which is not a popular one, in part because there's been kind of a lot of crude attempts to address this problem, the way in which companies tried to solve this was walling off whole parts of the internet where you couldn't go if there was any concern that there might be problematic content there. And we've come to a point in which the internet is so dynamic where not only are there brand new websites being created every few minutes that might contain inappropriate content for kids, but some of the largest, most popular platforms out there, like Twitter, like Instagram, like TikTok, have a lot of problematic content on it. And so we wanted to make sure that there was a way for kids to live in the world where you didn't have to wall off huge gardens, but that you could, with a scalpel, kind of take out just the bad. And so that really drove a lot of the development of the technology. We wanted to be able to give you the good of the internet without the bad, without significant time delays, without meaningfully harming the overall user experience.
Okay, so I'm going to try to wrap my head around what you guys do. My kids are still little, but my oldest is almost 10. I know that in a few years, he's going to want to get on social media of some sort, and my girls as well, right? And so your point is that we can basically have them live in a bubble and never go on social and not hand them the cell phone, but that doesn't seem very feasible. And so you guys have developed a technology that will basically allow parents to hand the phones to their children and while doing whatever on TikTok and on Instagram, protect them in some ways. Is that basically the concept behind it?
Yes, we wanted to get to a world in which you didn't have to choose between the safety and well-being of your kid and letting them be online. And so our first attempt to address that problem was to have software that you would install on your kids' devices, smartphone, tablet, computer, that as they browsed could identify bit by bit, image by image, word by word, video by video, and separate out what is acceptable and what contains something that might not be consistent with your values.
So how does that work?
So the way it currently works right now is that we have a VPN, which effectively, think of all the traffic from your child's device gets routed through our server, and we are able to look at every word, image, and video in milliseconds and identify if any of it contains nudity, minimal clothing, something that might not be appropriate for a kid to see. And either, if too much of it's bad, block the whole site, or just remove this image, just remove that video, but still serve up everything else. So the great example is you can still go to twitter.com and see the Elon Musk jokes and your little cat videos and your sports scores, confident that pornography, which there's a lot of on Twitter, will not actually populate on your kid's screen.
What does the app do with, does it shut down Twitter once just describe to me how it actually functions.
We have something called quilting, which is, imagine that you go, great example is like one of these British tabloids, where you have like legitimate news articles and then some questionable tabloidy type images there. We will just remove the tabloid, the individual image or video that contains problematic content, and still you can see everything else. So we're not shutting down the whole site unless that site has been determined to be, 55% pornographic content, in which case we'll shut it all down.
So you download the app onto your child's phone and it kind of like coats the other apps in that way, where it protects it from showing up with pornography or any inappropriate content like that?
Yes, so it was designed to work in the background. We do not want to frustrate the kid's ability to use the technology how it's designed to be used, because we know if it results in a bad user experience, kids are going to complain, they're going to have a fight with the parent, they're going to take it off. Without getting too much into the weeds, it works a little bit differently, app to app, operating system to operating system. There are some apps that we can filter in, like TikTok on iOS. We can filter all inappropriate content in there. We currently can't filter within the iOS app. It uses an encryption. And so we give parents the choice. Do you want your kid to be in Instagram, the app, or an Instagram on a browser? where we can filter everything within a browser. We've just developed the capability to push our filter from a server down onto the device, which will effectively mean that everything, offline content, you could be in a Zoom, you could be doing a live stream, and the second anything inappropriate appears on screen, we'll cut the feed.
So one of the things that you described to me is this new trend called sexting and sextortion. Can you just tell me a little bit more about that and how your technology is going to help navigate through those issues?
Yes, so I know it seems crazy, but sexting is effectively where you take a selfie of you wearing minimal clothing or no clothing whatsoever. And so while many parents still think that this is crazy, one of the stats that jumped out to me was that 2/3 of American teenage girls have been asked to send a nude photo of themselves to someone that they know. So this is much more prevalent than people think. And it's really alarming in terms of not only the incidents that it's happening, but the consequences after it gets out there. So in order to address this, we've taken our technology, which can identify nudity and minimal clothing in real time, and apply that towards photos taken by a device itself. So the second you take a selfie, let's say you're in a bikini or you're wearing no clothes, our software flags that and says, hey, are you sure you meant to take that photo? And then you, as the child, are given a choice. You can either send it to your mom and dad for approval, which hopefully you wouldn't do, or you can just delete it, no questions asked, and move on.
So if the child decides to send the picture of her or him being nude, some alert shows up and it basically says, if you're going to continue sending this, it would also send it to your parents. Is that right?
If you want to keep that photo, your parent is going to receive a copy of it. And so we hope that creates a little bit of a deterrent effect that and in some cases, again, we have one filter setting for nudity and one for minimal clothing. So in some cases, it could be an innocuous, a couple of friends are at the beach, there's nothing wrong, send it to mom and dad, they'll approve it, and then you're fine.
No issue.
Yes.
So what does Canopy do with the images, the sexts, once they're transferred into the system?
Great question. So obviously this is very sensitive content that's out there. So first thing to say is Canopy doesn't keep any of this data. On our servers, we do not collect or store any data about our customers for any reason. We don't rent it out. We don't sell it, anything like that. We really strive to make sure that we have good data privacy practices because we're dealing with sensitive stuff. In the instance in which a kid takes a sext and actually sends it to their parent for approval, which has happened before, shockingly enough. Once the parent looks at it and approves it or deletes it, it's gone. And we feel very strongly that parents need to know that if they're going to trust a software company to come in and try and walk alongside them, this is being done not by humans, but by artificial intelligence, right? No human ever looks at any content on a user's device. It's all AI-based machine learning algorithms that have been trained to identify this. So there's no Canopy employee there, is kind of going through.
Sitting and watching all the images. Yeah. What's so incredible about sexting is that, first of all, it's become so common, but it's also illegal, right? I mean, it's just, you can actually go to jail even as a minor if you're sending nude pictures of yourself or other girls and sharing that. But it's just become this common thing.
It can be prosecuted as the transmission of child pornography, which, again, if you're under the age of 18, by the legal definition of pornography, that's what it is. It's problematic from that perspective. I think a lot of kids aren't aware of the risks that attend doing it. But it's also problematic, as you and I well know, digital is forever. And even if you're sending it via a platform like Snapchat, which supposedly has disappearing images, someone else can take a screenshot of it. And it circulates. And so the stories that I hear that I think are most disconcerting to parents are where they have a son or a daughter that takes a photo and sends it to someone in a moment of trust, and then it gets out. And once it's out there, the consequences, especially psychologically, it can be significant. And it's just not something that kids, I think, are kind of prepared, or when they take the photo, they're really thinking about that. One rule of thumb that we've heard is don't send a photo that you wouldn't be comfortable having your grandmother see, which maybe goes a little bit too far, but I think a little bit of discretion in terms of what's being sent is warranted given just the sheer number of horror stories I've heard around this.
I mean, this is one of those things that teenagers are doing these days, right? It's their new way of dating. They'll send pictures of each other and one another, but then they break up and then they use it for something called sextortion, right? Which is a whole nother scary thing.
Yeah, and so oftentimes that's from significant others or exes where that comes into play. We also see this where kids are on platforms and they'll start sending relatively innocuous things, but then each time they send it, they'll get to a point where they've crossed the line, and the individual that's kind of engaged in the exploitation will say, do X, Y, or Z, or I'm going to release this. And oftentimes it's send more photos, which further empowers them to kind of extort them and have leverage over them, which is obviously pretty frightening.
What are the punishments for a minor who is sending pornography? I mean, this is pornography. And what are the punishments for somebody who's tried as an adult?
It can be jail time. It can be a pretty significant fine. It depends on whether you're merely trafficking it or you're actually engaged in the production of it. The fines and penalties for the actual production, which if you're taking a sext, that is what that's classified as, is more significant. Mm-hmm. And look, it's still relatively new, but during COVID, during the first few months of the lockdown, just the number of Google searches, how to take a good sext, went up, by 500%. And so this is becoming, regrettably, very common to be asked for sure, but then to actually participate in it. The last stat that I saw was that 1 out of 7 American teenagers has sent a nude photo of themselves to someone else, and that predates COVID. So I can only imagine that it's moved up considerably since then.
Oh my gosh. I mean, so we talked about the legal element of it, but there's also the mental element of it. And specifically, boys and girls, in some ways, in different ways, are really mentally impacted by this new early sexualization of children and using these devices to create this irrevocable damage. One of the things that you told me a few weeks ago when we spoke was how there are these times where there are spikes in pornography viewership, which I think is just shocking.
Yeah, so this actually came from Pornhub, which is one of the largest porn websites in the world. And every year they put out a data analytics report that kind of walks through how their platform's being used, most searched for terms, usage statistics, things like that. But they also put out something that demonstrates when there's relative spikes throughout the day. So unsurprisingly, you'll find that from 10 p.m. to midnight is when consumption goes up. There's one other period during the day where you see a spike relative to the time before and after, and that's between 3:30 and 4:30 p.m., which is right when kids are coming out of school.
Oh my
and
gosh.
So that's one data point, but it's very much corroborated by all the other data trends that we're seeing, which is the age of exposure to pornographic content is coming earlier and earlier for kids. And this very much attends that we've distributed devices, smartphones, tablets, to kids at earlier and earlier ages, where at a couple clicks of the button, through no fault of their own, more often than not. One stat that horrifies me is that 62% of first exposure to problematic content is accidental. They're not even trying to find something, but it's finding them. And so kids are growing up and they're being put in situations where they're confronting this type of content early, before oftentimes they've been prepared. And that kind of oftentimes can set in motion curiosity to trying to understand what it is. And as they go searching for answers, it's not oftentimes to the parent, but it's this online world that might have different lessons to teach than what you or I would if we're sitting down talking to our kids.
Your team has done incredible research about the impact of a child's brain when exposed to this early sexualization. Will you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes, and we think this is incredibly important because if you look at the broader history of people that are trying to talk about how pornography impacts kids, it oftentimes comes from a posture of person of faith who has a moral argument against pornography, and they're advancing that. And I think one of the things that is interesting over the last 20 years is that there's been a lot of advances in neuroscience where we now actually understand the impact of pornography on the brain. And we can talk about how a pornography addiction mirrors other types of addictions in terms of the parts of the brain that it lights up and the difficulty stepping away from it, how it hijacks the reward system, how it leverages dopamine. We can talk about all of these things now from a scientific perspective. So it's no longer conjecture. There are actually a lot of people from Johns Hopkins and Harvard who are studying this in their white lab coats and saying, this is what's happening to your child's brain when they're exposed to this type of content. And so I think it's really shifted the conversation from one in which the various sides kind of retreat to their corners to one in which you have authorities from the medical and scientific community saying, yeah, this raises a lot of questions and exposure could be a big source of harm for kids. That's really shifted how the broader conversation is progressing.
So what are the things that you've learned from this research that really have an impact on?
We can talk about how the way to think of your kid's brain is that it's like clay, and it's wet clay, and the earlier your child is, the younger your child is, you can mold it. And the older they get, it hardens a little bit and becomes harder to mold. And so the earlier they are exposed to different types of highly intense content, the more that it can shape them, which is why the age of exposure to something like pornography has a big impact in how they will think about it. And we can study this at the neurochemical level, or we can talk about their sexual template and their understanding and expectations of what's normal. And so we understand that. Secondly, we've come to understand that there is a brain's innate desire for novelty, especially with respect to sexual reward. And it's actually called the Coolidge effect, but the brain effectively constantly needs novelty in order to reach satiation. And so this is why when kids are exposed early, oftentimes if someone then becomes a pornography consumer over 2 years, their taste will change dramatically. And we now know why. It's in pursuit of that high that you have to kind of constantly introduce a transgression or taboo or more extreme content. And so this is why you'll see teenagers go in radically different directions and start to seek out more violent, oftentimes, content as they progress. We now understand at a neurochemical level why that's happening and what's kind of driving that. And then I think third, just the big thing is we have a lot more information now about the extent to which pornography can be addictive and how it lights up the brain and how it's got an escalation function built in. Now that we can understand what's actually happening in your child's brain, I think it gives a lot of people license to come out and have this conversation. It's taboo, it's icky, right? Like people don't want to talk about this, despite the fact that it's causing a lot of harm. And you can see this in evidence and data about psychology, whether it's physical effects, right? Shockingly, and we're seeing increase in erectile dysfunction among 20-year-olds, which like shouldn't happen.
Why do you think this is happening? Because they were exposed to pornography at an early age?
Yeah, it's called porn-induced erectile dysfunction. Typically, it's found among men of a certain age where like the pipes just stop working. Porn-induced erectile dysfunction has nothing to do with the viability of their broader body. It's all psychological. They need to see a certain type of extreme content in order to be aroused. And so pornography has created the environment in which only certain types of things that really are kind of pushing the boundaries will get them to that state. And
is this mostly impacting boys only, or is it also impacting young girls and women?
I think historically we tend to think of this as a problem for boys and for men in particular. The data is that you still find that the majority of kind of the regular users are boys, but girls are very quickly catching up. And I think a big part of that, Jonathan Haidt, I think, was the one who made this point that we are now spending a lot more time dwelling in visually oriented platforms, and that this is what is kind of creating an expectation and norm that the very next logical step is some familiarity with pornography.
You know, one of my greatest concerns when I think about sexting and sextortion is I actually have been very focused on the girls and the women because what it does to their mental state and the depression and, you know, people looking at them and sharing all these images of them. But I think people are, and maybe even myself, are forgetting how dangerous this is even for young boys who are essentially going to be living with this, you know, problem for many years if we don't address it.
Yes. Well, I think you're right. I mean, if you look at the data today, Dr. Jean Twenge and Jonathan Haidt have come out with a lot of research that really shows that among teenagers, girls are struggling at a much higher level than boys are. If you look at the last 10 years, both boys and girls have seen a doubling of major depressive episodes in a year. But boys, it went from about 4% to about 10%. Girls went from about 12% to 25%. So 1 out of 4 girls over the course of a year is having a major depressive episode, which is problematic. And so I think you're right to focus on that. The data suggests that they are struggling with much higher level with social media. I think to understand the impact on boys, the right mental model is think of pornography as radiation. You may not see the effect of radiation immediately, but it's resulting in failure to launch. It's resulting in marriages that are being dissolved. It's resulting in physical changes that are problematic, and the data is there to support that. You don't see it as much right when they're 16 to 18, but when you get past 18, that's when boys really are demonstrating that they're being left behind. They're not going to college. They're dropping out of college. They're not graduating from high school. They're not entering into relationships. They're not holding down jobs. And I'm not for a second suggesting that pornography is the root of all of this, but I do think it has a role to play.
One of the things that I think about you guys after we hang out with all of you techies is I go home and I say to my husband, this is what I keep hearing them say, don't get high on your own supply, right? And so many of you are not actually allowing your kids to be on social media in early years. You're trying to limit social media. And so, I just think that I wish the world would hear this, because if the people who are making this content are aware of the fact that it is addicting, that it's going to hurt them, that it's going to sentence them with a more difficult life, the rest of the public should hear this too. And so I'd love for you to comment a little bit about that and just how do you guys navigate through this life of, you're in the tech world, you're obviously using this technology to advance yourselves and you advance the world, but on the other hand, you are preventing your children from being, on these devices.
It's a tricky question, and I come at this with a lot of humility. I've got 4 kids, and we're kind of bumbling our way, trying to figure this out. And I think one of the bigger points is that parents today have to have a new playbook. Like, I can't look at what my parents did with me and my sister because it's a completely different world. So the first point is just we have a lot of humility with how we try and address what we're doing in our own household. That said, I think the more that you understand how technology is being developed and a lot of the incentives that are at play, especially with Google and Facebook, you'll see that these are companies that profit by harvesting your attention. And they've effectively figured out, to use the words of James Williams, who wrote a fantastic book on this called Stand Out of Our Light. They have business models that hack your cognitive vulnerabilities. They've identified your weaknesses. And these companies employ big teams of neuroscientists to do this. And they're going up against your adolescent hormonal kid, who's trying to figure out their way in the world. And they know exactly what buttons to push to get them to spend that incremental 5 seconds, minute, if it's TikTok, hour on the device engaged with their content. And so at the very outset, I think you have to recognize that the designs of these companies are not necessarily what the designs that you as a parent would have for your kids. What they want to achieve, what their objectives are not your objectives. And so that is why we in our household have adopted a very cautious, skeptical approach. We're big fans at Canopy, but also in the Clifford household, just push this stuff off as long as you can. We're not anti-tech. I think tech's amazing. I think during COVID, tech was a lifeline for so many people in terms of your ability to continue studying, to keep in touch with loved ones. So much of our social life has moved online. It only accelerated during COVID. So I don't think it's a bad thing. And I don't want to live in a world where we take all of this away, where that's the only option that you confront as a parent. But I do think we have to figure out how to live with technology well. And we're still kind of struggling to figure that out. So
what is your advice? I know you have these 3 rules, so let's hear them.
Okay, so this is for parents. So the first is you have to update your paradigm. And I think parents need to be very acutely aware of what it means for a kid to grow up in a digital world. Their social life is their digital life and vice versa. And the extent to which you're intervening in their digital life, you're intervening in their social life. Understanding what they can confront online. Returning to pornography, I think a lot of parents still have this mental model where it's a Playboy under someone's bed.
They do. It's a very different thing these days, right?
It is completely different. The potency of what kids are encountering online is just much, much greater than anything that they encountered before. Playboy was 12 static images. You can get infinite access to HD
It was
videos.
basically the Victoria's Secret magazine, right? Today's Victoria's Secret brochure is what Playboy was years ago, basically.
Which is crazy. And in fact, Playboy, because they couldn't keep up with free pornography online for a while, actually stopped publishing nude photos. But be that as it may, parents need to update their mental model because the world that your kid is growing up in is completely different. And the sooner that you understand that and understand that you need to have a new playbook, I think the better situated you'll be to navigate this. I think the second big thing is you have to communicate with your kids early and often. First part of that is you have to create the space for good, meaningful conversations. And that's going to be different kid to kid. One best practice here is be shoulder to shoulder, right? Not necessarily in a direct contact, because hard conversations that need to take place, if you are shoulder to shoulder, might be easier. But find a way, a regular outlet where your kid has that opportunity to have hard conversations with you. I think the second thing is parents need to explain the why. If you're going to embark on a path in which you are limiting the use of technology as your kid grows, you need to tell them why. You're actually doing this because you love them, because you want them ultimately to have a good childhood and to grow into the world where they'll have full utilization of all the tools that are out there, but the ability to use them in ways that actually help them live well. And that's why I think the mental model for parents and kids should be that of a car. It's like, as a parent, I want my kids someday to get their driver's license and have the freedom that comes with driving a car, but it's a big responsibility. And they need to understand that this device can do a lot of harm and that they're going to obtain ever greater levels of use of it as they progress. I think the third big thing that parents need to do is actually set the table for success. And by that, I mean like adopt actions in your own home, in your own life that are going to equip your kid to emerge at the other end of 18 with some ability to use tech responsibly. So what does that actually look like? Number one, I think you need to find a tribe. Go find other parents that are willing to adopt similar rules as you and similar practices in how they use technology. If your kid is the only one in their class of 20 that doesn't have access to social media, that's hard. If they're one of 8 that are, as that group of 8, abstaining, it becomes incrementally easier for them to do that. So go find a tribe that wants to live out a different way. I think the second thing there is that you have to crowd it out. If you're going to take something away from your kid, give them something in its place that's actually compelling to them. So this will look different for different people. But for my son, if I got him, I was like, we're not going to get you a phone and you're not going to have any tech time, but we're going to sign you up for these Ninja Warrior classes. For him, he would take that trade-off. And every time he thought about not being part of something else, he would say, but this is what I have instead. So I think that can be really helpful. And then the third is like, you need to be an exemplar. There's this great book called The Tech Wise Family in which Andy Crouch said in 2017, when the iPhone turned 10, there was a generation of 10-year-olds in America who had spent their entire life competing with the iPhone for their parents' attention and oftentimes losing, which to me was just heartbreaking. In part because I felt that, right? Like I am prone to, on the couch, pull it out, or...
We're addicted too.
Yes, we're enamored with these devices. And we're in this honeymoon period where each individual interaction with it seems so innocuous and so simple. I'm like, there's nothing wrong with me checking my email right now. But aggregated up, my kids see that and they're saying, this is okay. I see how this works. So being an exemplar for your kids is important. Which I think gets to the last point, which is, I think the extent to which you can adopt a family tech contract that has rules that apply throughout. So in the Clifford household, no phones at the table ever. We do not ever bring phones out at the table, restaurant or at home. We never let phones into a bedroom.
Not even at the restaurant. You
No,
don't use the phone as
especially
a
not at the
babysitter.
restaurant. No. I cannot tell you, when we go out to restaurants now.
And you have 4 kids.
We do. And it's hard. It is not always an enjoyable experience for my wife and I, because we are really attuned to it.
Yeah.
But our kids, mine are 10, 9, 6, and 3. They've gotten to the point now where like they can sit at a table and behave. And it's beautiful. And we as a result have great family dinners now. There was like a 3-year period where like that was miserable, but we worked through it. And I think it's important for them to do that because if you go out to any restaurant today and you just like look around, more than 50% of the time, groups of people there, someone will have it out.
Totally.
And I think it really detracts from like the interpersonal connection that comes from when you're actually engaging with someone and there's no distractions. It's powerful, especially in post-COVID when we were so starved for this kind of interaction. If you can do that well, I think it's makes all the difference. But last thing on the contract, everyone has to sign up for it. If the parents aren't buying in, if they're not willing to actually abide by the rules too, that's where it really starts to break down. So I'd almost advise parents, don't adopt rules in your house that you yourself aren't willing to fully follow.
Well, that's always the case, right? Parents who are, I'm going to threaten you with this and that, and they never actually follow up on the threat. That's actually worse because then nobody believes in the contract, right?
Right.
I want to ask you a question about, you said start early, start talking to them early. So how early is the right time in your opinion? One of the issues that I have is I struggle with the fact that, my son is 10, I have a daughter that's 7 and another daughter that's 4.5. And I want to preserve their innocence on the one hand, right? And so I don't want to bring up these conversations about, sex and even the issues of transgender and all of these political issues that are now creeping into our kids' lives. I want to shelter them because I feel like a child should deserve to be a child. But on the other hand, like you say, we need to be the first to have those conversations with them, because if we're not the first to have the conversation with them, somebody else will be the first and they will taint their vision on it and have that impact on them. And so I think many parents like me are struggling with, well, how far can we push it? But, starting too soon is really, dangerous as well.
It's a tricky question. And I couldn't agree more. I don't want to have this conversation with my kids right now. My oldest is 10. I still think that it's too soon to go there. I don't feel comfortable. I don't want to do it. And so I'll acknowledge that at the very outset. The thing that has motivated me to have those conversations is that I don't want them to find out about this from somewhere else. And that first experience and exposure be something that oftentimes, when you're young and you're trying to figure things out, it can be very formative. So what do? I think there are a number of resources out there. One that we've used is Good Pictures, Bad Pictures. It's a book that in a very age-appropriate way for a 6 and 7-year-old talks about how people do crazy things out there. And it does it in a way where my kids walked out of that book, they still didn't know what sex was. But they did know that there were a couple of red flags that they should be mindful of. And so there are age-appropriate ways to start having the conversation. And keep in mind, it's conversations. It's not I had the talk, we're good, check that off my parenting list. So I think one is there are age-appropriate things that you can find out there and resources that help you navigate it. I think the second thing is really preparing that space to have the hard conversations with your kids. I want my kids to know that when they have those types of questions, and I've said, hey, you guys are gonna have questions, especially as you get to this age, and your friends are gonna say this, this is the time every week where you and I do this, where you can we'll talk about it. And sometimes I'll ask questions, and sometimes they'll be the one to bring stuff up. But creating that space where your kids do feel comfortable is hard, but I think it will really make a difference.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. I was thinking about it this past weekend when I was spending time with my kids, where I do allow them to be on social media devices. And while right now they're still young and they're just watching things that are totally fine, the fact that they're being conditioned to think that they can go and take the device into their room and shut the door and watch something, even though what they're watching is okay right now, in a few years it won't be okay. And so basically at early years, we're going to make these family rules where if you are on a device, you're going to be in the family room, not in your own bedroom. And all of those kind of family contracts, I think, are helpful just to lay the field for later days where it is more difficult, right? Once they hit 6th grade, it's so difficult to ask them to do things and to listen to us.
I think that's exactly right. And I think if you compare those rules with a strong articulation of the why, which is both what you want for them ultimately, which is you want them to get to the point where they can use these devices well, but also what they're up against. My wife got her PhD in neuroscience, and so we kind of have geeky conversations with our kids. But one of the things that jumped out was understanding and teaching our kids what these devices do to their brains, how they've been designed, and the consequences of that. And I'll just give you one example. I know you're very familiar with dopamine. It's kind of a maligned neurochemical. It actually does a lot of good things, and so it gets a bad rap. But our devices have been designed to hijack the dopamine system. So every time you go on your device, they have variable rewards, and it gives you little pings when someone likes your message, when you get new emails coming to your box, things like that, which oftentimes drive you to spend more time in the device. One thing that we've learned, and there's a great book out there about this that kind of documents it, called The Hacking of the American Mind, that dopamine crowds out serotonin. So just to take a step back, serotonin is the chemical that you feel when you're content, when you're happy, when you've hiked a mountain and you've summited and you're at the top and maybe you're hungry and cold. So it's not the superficial, pleasurable feeling. It's the I've done something worthy. And you get this when your kid has done well on a project or you reach a milestone in your marriage. It's those types of moments that yield this sense of contentment. And what we've discovered in the last decade is that dopamine actually blocks serotonin. And so the more that these devices flood your brain with dopamine, it's actually blocking your ability to feel that true sense of contentment. I mean, we are literally creating circumstances in which our kids can't feel happy, truly happy, which leaves them only the pursuit of pleasure, which is what dopamine does. And so I know that's a lot. I know not all kids are ready for that, but the more the kids understand that this is what's going on, and at Canopy, one of the things that we detect all the time that gives me hope in a strange way is that the kids are really unhappy and they know their devices are the cause of it. And that gives me hope because they're the ones that recognize this and they want to do something about it.
Fascinating. I mean, I think it's not just the kids. I don't know that parents are aware of just the chemistry behind all of this, right? I think if parents are aware of how dangerous these little devices are, maybe they'll have a better sense of how to, prevent their kids from becoming total addicts.
Yes. And I think we're still in the honeymoon phase, right?
Yeah.
We've not developed the cultural or social antibodies to really figure out like how to put some healthy boundaries around this and put tech in its proper place. I think the proper focus remains on kids though, because they are in a much more formative phase. Like when I got my first smartphone, I was already out of college, right? So like I was more or less set.
Yeah.
And like you can still change, there is neuroplasticity, but it's nowhere near as formative as when you're growing up with this.
Right, now they start at age 11.
Yes, if not earlier.
Or if not earlier, right?
Yeah, and it shapes them in really profound ways that we're still unpacking.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much for what you're doing. I'd love to get a better sense of the actual technology. And so I'd love to just hear a little bit about what are some other devices or apps that are out there that are protecting kids from this stuff, and just learn a little bit more on Canopy.
Fantastic.
Okay, great.
There's a few things out there. The first is, if you're going to get a device for your kid, you need to make the determination, do you want it to be smart or not? You want them to have internet connectivity and apps and things like that on their device. If you go down that route, I think there's there's a fork in the road. You can go with something that's built explicitly for kids. There's a company out there called Bark that has just launched and released a new phone explicitly for kids to try and allow them to be engaging with apps and the internet, but in a responsible way.
So Bark is an actual phone. It's not an app.
Bark's a technology company that had software, but just launched a phone.
Okay.
Where it's the hardware with the software pre-installed. There's another company like that called Gab, which has a kid-friendly phone, another one called Pinwheel. All three of them are really good options. They each kind of focus on different things. But if you want to get your child kind of a starter phone, I oftentimes will recommend that because it's a way for them to have exposure to it, to start to learn how to use it responsibly. Again, with the full intention that eventually they'll get to the full Android or the full iPhone, as the case may be. Then there's the question of, if you're going to go the traditional route and get, an iPhone, an Android, a tablet, or laptop for your kid, can you install software on that? If you do that, there's kind of three different types of things that you can do. The first is there's software that will limit how much time they're spending on different apps or on the computer or device overall. Circle is a great example of that. NetNanny is a tool that provides that. Bark, Canopy. Most of the tools can kind of limit where kids are spending time online. The second thing is social media monitoring. Bark, I think, has the best technology to date that enables you to understand what your kid is doing in the online world. If your kid is bullying someone, if your kid is being bullied, if they're engaging in sexual conversations, you as the parent will receive notification that your kid is partaking in that, and that provides a prompt for you then to go have the conversation with your kid. It's like, hey, and Bark has done well. They don't send you everything. They only provide you those prompts when it's something that they think is a trigger for a conversation. And so that's a way to kind of understand what your kid is being exposed to online. Then the third category is preventing exposure to indecent content. And that's where I think Canopy really differentiates itself in our ability to immediately detect all pornographic content and then keep it from actually appearing on your phone, to stop sexting, things like that. But all three are very valid and worthwhile things to do.
So helpful. I mean, I hear so much about the problem, but actually hearing about some potential solutions. And I know there is no silver bullet to anything. Obviously, parents still need to be parents and they need to show up and listen and pay attention. But having technologies like this it's certainly helpful. So let me grab my phone and maybe you can show me a little bit about how they work and specifically how Canopy works.
Fantastic. Canopy is a software that you can download to your phone, tablet, or computer. We have an app for parents, which is kind of like your dashboard, where you can update settings on your kids' devices, grant approval for if they want to send you a photo to look at, give them more screen time, things like that. And then we have an app for kids, which really is where all the hard back-end technology exists, that is the filter that's working in real time in the background. Again, our hope is that the kids know, first of all, that Canopy is on their device.
Right.
We don't want to be one of those companies where they don't know. Like it's a visible app in there, and they only go there when they want to request permission to visit a website that has been blocked or have a photo reviewed.
Well, part of that is teaching them the awareness as well, right? Knowing that the app is there because there is danger out there.
Yes, and our hope is to actually foster healthy communication between parents and kids. We could kind of put it in the background, but we want to be a tool that walks alongside families and not something that's the source of friction between them.
Well, thank you guys so much for what you're doing, and thanks for the app.
We're
I got it
trying,
now.
yes.
I love it.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you, Marissa.